Hello, Fanatics. Welcome to another episode of my true crime story time. If you enjoy diamond painting and enjoy true crime, please do consider joining me on my true crime journey by hitting that subscribe button. I'd love to have you. I try to do a true crime premiere every Thursday. I do have a playlist of my true crime story time. Feel free to check that out. If you're in the comment section with me right now, a massive hello to you. If you are watching on replay, a massive hello to you and thank you for tuning in. Now, it feels very, very wrong. I'm not going to lie. It feels very, very wrong to be working on a mystery diamond painting. Pretty much know what it is by now. But either way, working on a Christmas diamond painting, talking about true crime, is not good. But here we are, nonetheless, doing just that. So please do grab your projects, whatever you are working on, grab a drink. I think we're going to be here for quite a while because there's things that I would like to chat about before I begin. I googled the worst serial killers, and our very own, and by our very own I mean here in England, is Dr. Harold Shipman. He, according to Google, is the very worst of the worst serial killers there is out there. I have covered him in my true crime playlist. But this guy, who we're going to be talking about today, is... I don't even know where to begin. No matter how messed up your childhood is, no matter how many times you bang your head, or whatever the red flags that happen with these depraved individuals, it just begs the question why, doesn't it? That's the intriguing thing about the whole true crime community. Obviously there's a lot of people on YouTube that cover true crime. There is documentaries, TV shows, Netflix, Amazon Prime, all hundreds and hundreds of these true crime things. And people with everyday lives, they go to work, they come home, they raise their children, stay-at-home mums. It does bring a whole community together, diving into true crime, and I appreciate you if you are here for that. So I just have a morbid curiosity into it, as you all do. I'm sorry, the bin men are collecting all the cardboard this week, so they are in the background being noisy. So let's dive in. Today I am going to talk about Theodore Bundy, also known as Ted Bundy. As always, I'm going to start with his childhood, moving into Lord knows. I just wish this guy, he wasn't bad looking. He had charisma. He was well spoken. Imagine the amount of good he would have done had he taken another path. Instead of putting all of this evil into the world, imagine the good he could have done if he'd have just picked something else that he was good at. Not only did he commit heinous acts, he escaped prison. He had probably a genius mind in some capacity. So if he had just turned into inventing something good for the world, he would have succeeded, I'm sure. But as we know, we are sat here right now on a true crime playlist, so clearly that didn't happen. Clearly he had severe issues going on and chose a very dark path instead. Okay, let's begin. Childhood. Ted Bundy was born Theodore Robert Cowell on November the 24th in 1946 to Eleanor Louise. She was known by her middle name, but Theodore was born at the Elizabeth Lund Home for Unwed Mothers in Burlington, Vermont. His biological father's identity has never been confirmed. His original birth certificate apparently assigns paternity to a salesman and United States Air Force veteran named Lloyd Marshall, though a copy of it listed his father as unknown. Louise claimed she met a war veteran named Jack Worthington, who abandoned her soon after she became pregnant. Census records revealed that several men by the name of Jack Worthington and Lloyd Marshall lived in the area when Bundy was conceived. Some family members expressed suspicions that Bundy might have been fathered by Louise's own father. But there was a documentary in 2020 known as Crazy Not Insane. Questionable. But the psychiatrist Dorothy Lewis claimed to have arranged for a DNA test which confirmed that Bundy was not the product of abuse, should we say. So, a quick side note here. The birth certificate apparently assigns paternity to Lloyd Marshall, but then Louise claimed to have met Jack Worthington, who abandoned her soon after she was pregnant. And okay, it happens. I'm not doubting that, but where did Lloyd come from? Was he a boyfriend that stuck around for a while, or... Anyway, moving on. So for the first 3 years of his life, Bundy lived in the Philadelphia home of his maternal grandparents, Samuel and Eleanor. Okay, so we're going to call Bundy's mum Louise to avoid confusion. So they raised him as their son to avoid social stigma and accompanied birth outside of wedlock at that time. Family, friends, and even young Ted were told that his grandparents were his parents and that his mother was his older sister. Bundy eventually discovered the truth, although his recollections of the circumstances varied. He told a girlfriend that a cousin showed him a copy of the birth certificate after calling him a barstool. Not quite, but you get the point. But he told biographers, Stephen and Hugh, that he found the birth certificate himself. Now, I'm not taking away the trauma that would have brought, from being a very young boy, believing that your mum and dad are your mum and dad, to find out that actually your sister is your mum and that's your nana and granddad. That must have been a bit of a trauma to deal with, and I can't imagine having to come to terms with that personally. But even so, biographer and true crime writer Anne Rule, who knew Bundy personally, wrote that he did not find out until 1969 when he located his original birth record in Vermont. Bundy expressed a lifelong resentment towards his mother for never talking to him about his real father and for leaving him to discover his true parentage for himself. And I get that. I do get that. I think over time you would get over it. Do you know what I mean? Perhaps a few therapy sessions along the way. I'm just putting my opinions in there. You guys like my opinions, so. Bundy occasionally exhibited disturbing behaviour at an early age. Louise's younger sister Julia recalled awakening from a nap to find herself surrounded by knives from the kitchen and 3-year-old Ted standing by the bed, smiling. Now that's gotta be creepy. I mean, that would be creepy at any age, but when your 3-year-old, what would be nephew, has done that, it's eerie. And he wouldn't have found out his true parentage at 3. He wouldn't have understood it. So, yeah, creepy. Bundy's childhood neighbour, Sandy Holt, described him as a bully, saying, quote, "He liked to terrify people. He liked to be in charge. He liked to inflict pain and suffering and fear." End quote. In some interviews, Bundy spoke warmingly of his grandparents and told Anne, the biographer, that he, quote, identified with, respected and clung to his grandfather. In 1987, however, he and other family members told attorneys that Samuel was a tyrannical bully who beat his wife and dog, exhibited bigotry, including religious intolerance, racism, and swung neighbourhood cats by their tails. Now, okay, it seems a little far-fetched, in my opinion, but actually not so much, because in my personal life, my bully, as you may or may not know, but he took his mood out on our dogs. So that's not as far-fetched to me as it would be to anyone else. In one instance, Samuel, Grandad, threw Julia down a flight of stairs for oversleeping. He sometimes spoke aloud to unseen presences and at least once flew into a violent rage when the question of Bundy's paternity was raised. Bundy described his grandmother as a timid and obedient woman who periodically underwent electroconvulsive therapy for depression and feared to leave their house towards the end of her life. These descriptions of Bundy's grandparents have been questioned in more recent investigations. Some locals remembered Samuel, Grandad, as a, quote, fine man, if a bit eccentric, end quote. A cousin of Bundy claimed that the negative characterizations of Samuel, Grandad, likely arose to explain why his grandson became a serial killer. In addition, Louise's sister Audrey stated that their mother couldn't leave their home because she suffered a stroke due to being overweight and not mentally well. And in 1950, Louise changed her surname from Cowell to Nelson, and at the urging of multiple family members, left Philadelphia with Ted to live with cousins Alan and Jane Scott in Tacoma, Washington. In 1951, she met Johnny, a hospital cook, at an adult singles night in Tacoma's First Methodist Church. They married later that year, and Johnny formally adopted Ted. Johnny and Louise conceived 4 children together, and though Johnny tried to include his adopted son in camping trips and other family activities, Ted remained distant from him. He would later complain to a girlfriend that Johnny wasn't his real father, and that Johnny, quote, wasn't very bright and didn't make much money, end quote. Bundy varied his recollections of Tacoma in later years. To the authors, he described roaming his neighbourhood, picking through trash barrels in search of pictures of naked women, and to Polly Nelson, he said that he pursued detective magazines, crime novels, and true crime documentaries for stories that involved sexual violence, particularly when the stories were illustrated with pictures of dead or maimed women. And I'm going to call it here because I'm very much into true crime, and I'm going to be in trouble. No, just kidding. In a letter to Anne Rule, the author, however, he asserted that he never, ever read fact detective magazines and shuddered at the thought that anyone would, end quote. He also said that he would consume large quantities of alcohol and, quote, canvass the community, end quote, late at night in search of undraped windows where he could observe women undressing or, quote, whatever else could be seen, end quote. Accounts of Bundy's social life also varied. He told the 2 authors that he, quote, chose to be alone, end quote, as an adolescent because he was unable to understand interpersonal relationships. He claimed that he had no natural sense of how to develop friendships. Quote, I didn't know what made people want to be friends. I didn't know what underlay social interactions, end quote. Classmates from Woodrow Wilson High School, however, told Rule that Bundy was, quote, well known and well liked, a medium-sized fish in a large pond, end quote. Bundy's only significant athletic avocation was downhill skiing, which he pursued enthusiastically with stolen equipment and a forged lift ticket. During high school, he was arrested at least twice on suspicion of burglary and motor vehicle theft. When he reached the age of 18, the details of the incidents were expunged from his record, as is customary in Washington and many other US states. Why? Because you're a minor, I guess. But in this case, it probably would have been handy. After graduating from high school in 1965, Bundy attended University of Puget Sound, UPS, not the delivery people, for 1 year before transferring to the University of Washington to study Chinese. In 1967, he became romantically involved with a classmate, Diane Edwards. She goes by several pseudonyms in books. In early 1968, Bundy dropped out of college and worked a series of minimum wage jobs. He also volunteered at the Seattle office of Nelson Rockefeller's presidential campaign and became Arthur Fletcher's driver and bodyguard during Fletcher's campaign for Lieutenant Governor of Washington State. In August, Bundy attended the 1968 Republican National Convention in Miami as a Rockefeller delegate. Shortly thereafter, Edwards ended their relationship and returned to her family home in California. Frustrated by what she describes as Bundy's immaturity and lack of ambition. Psychiatrist Dorothy Lewis would later pinpoint this crisis as, quote, probably the pivotal time in his development, end quote. Devastated by the breakup, Bundy travelled to Colorado and then further east, visiting relatives in Arkansas and Philadelphia and enrolling for 1 semester at Temple University. Just a side note here, and I'm sure you can all attest, there has been university romances, school romances, first job romances, and all of that. Was it pivotal in his development? Yes, because it was a life lesson to be learned, but I don't think it was pivotal. I think pivotal time would have been when he found out that his nanny and granddad were not his mum and dad. That was probably a pivotal time in his development, but he was also putting swords down at 3 years old, so kind of irrelevant really, in my opinion. It was also at this time in early 1969 that Rule believed that Bundy visited the Office of Birth Records in Burlington and confirmed his true parentage. And there is the pivotal moment, not a breakup, in my opinion. Bundy was back in Washington by the fall of 1969 when he met Elizabeth. Again, goes by different names in the books and so on and so forth, a single mother from Ogden, Utah, who worked as a secretary at the School of Medicine at the same University of Washington, I believe. Their stormy relationship would continue well past his initial incarceration at Utah in 1976. Bundy became a father figure to Elizabeth's daughter Molly, who was then 3 years old, when he started dating her mother. He remained in her life until she was 10, after he had been arrested. As an adult, Molly wrote of incidents beginning at the age of 7 in which Bundy was abusive or sexually inappropriate with her. Her accounts include Bundy hitting her in the face, knocking her down, putting her at risk of drowning, indecent exposure, and sexual touching disguised as, quote, games. By mid-1970, Bundy, now focused and goal-orientated, re-enrolled at the University of Washington, this time as a psychology major. He then became an honour student, was well regarded by his professors. He took a job in 1971 at a Seattle suicide hotline crisis centre and turned his life around, went on his merry way, and no one knows any more about this guy. If only. So he was working at the Seattle Suicide Hotline Crisis Centre when he met and worked alongside Anne Rule, a former Seattle police officer and aspiring crime writer who would later write one of the definitive Bundy biographies, The Stranger Beside Me. Rule saw nothing disturbing in Bundy's personality at the time. She described him as kind and empathic. After graduating from the University of Washington in 1972, Bundy joined Governor Daniel J. Evans' re-election campaign. Posing as a college student, he shadowed Evans' opponent, former Governor Albert Rossellini, and recorded his stump speeches for analysis by Evans' team. Evans appointed Bundy to the Seattle Crime Prevention Advisory Committee. This is so ironic, isn't it? So now he's got a degree in psychology. He's worked at the suicide prevention hotline. He's been appointed to Seattle's crime prevention. And we haven't even got started yet. After Evans was re-elected, Bundy was hired as an assistant to Ross Davis, chairman of the Washington State Republican Party. Davis thought well of Bundy and described him as smart, aggressive, and a believer in the system. Oh dear. In early 1973, despite mediocre LSAT scores, LSAT scores, Bundy was accepted into the Law of Schools of UPS and the University of Utah on the strength of letters of recommendation from Evans, Davis, and several University of Washington psychology professors. Now that's going to get you anywhere, isn't it? Recommendation letters from very well-to-do politicians and stuff. During a trip to California on Republican Party business in the summer of 1973, Bundy rekindled his relationship with Edwards. She marvelled at his transformation into a serious and dedicated professional who was seemingly on the cusp of a significant legal and political career. Bundy continued to date Elizabeth as well. Neither woman was aware of the other one's existence. In January 1974, Bundy abruptly broke off all contact with Edwards. Her phone calls and letters went unreturned. When she finally reached him by telephone a month later, she demanded to know why he had ghosted her, basically, ended their relationship without explanation. In a flat, calm voice, he replied, "Diane, I have no idea what you mean," and hung up. She never heard from him again. Bundy later explained, quote, "I just wanted to prove to myself that I could have married her." End quote. But Edwards concluded in retrospect that he had deliberately planned the entire courtship and rejection in advance as vengeance for the breakup she initiated in 1968. Yeah, I'm inclined to agree with her because he seems to hold a grudge. By then, Bundy had begun skipping classes at law school, and by April he had stopped attending altogether, as young women began to disappear in the Pacific Northwest. There was no consensus as to when or where Bundy began killing women. He told different stories to different people and refused to divulge the specifics of his earliest crimes, even as he confessed in graphic detail to dozens of later murders in the days preceding his execution. He told Nelson that he attempted his first kidnapping in 1969 in Ocean City, New Jersey, but did not kill anyone until sometime in 1971 in Seattle. He told psychologist Art Norman that he killed 2 women while in Atlantic City while visiting family in Philadelphia in 1969. Bundy hinted to homicide detective Robert Keppel that he committed a murder in Seattle in 1972 and another murder in 1973 that involved a hitchhiker near Tumwater, but he refused to elaborate. Rule and Keppel both believed that he might have started killing as a teenager. Bundy's earliest documented homicides were committed in 1974 when he was 27 years old. By his own admission, he had by then mastered the necessary skills in the era before DNA profiling to leave minimal incriminating forensic evidence at crime scenes. Now, side note here, he has been working for the crime prevention unit. He knows he would have asked questions without doubt, and it would have been linked to a case to make it less suspicious. But he's not silly, is he? He is not silly. At any point in so far has he been silly in any way, let his guard down in any way. I'm starting to get upset now because I know what's coming. Shortly after midnight on January the 4th, 1974, around the time he terminated his relationship with Edwards, Bundy entered the basement apartment of 18-year-old Karen Sparks, who again goes by different names in the books, a dancer and student at the University of Washington. After bludgeoning Karen with a metal rod from her bed frame, he sexually assaulted her with either the same rod, causing extensive internal injuries. She remained unconscious in the hospital for 10 days, and although she survived, she was left with physical disabilities. That's so sad. In the early morning hours of February the 1st, Bundy broke into the basement room of Linda Ann Healy, a University of Washington undergraduate who broadcast morning radio weather reports for skiers. He beat her unconscious, dressed her in blue jeans and a white blouse and boots, and carried her away. During the first half of 1974, female college students disappeared at the rate of about 1 per month. On the 12th of March, Donna Gail Manson, a 19-year-old student at the Evergreen State College in Olympia, 60 miles southwest of Seattle, left her dormitory to attend a jazz concert on campus, but never arrived. On April the 17th, Susan Elaine Rancourt disappeared while on her way to her dorm room after an evening advisors meeting at Central Washington State College in Ellensburg, 110 miles southeast of Seattle. 2 female Central Washington students later came forward to report encounters, one on the night of Rancourt's disappearance, the other 3 nights earlier with a man wearing a sling who was asking for help carrying a load of books to his brown or tan Volkswagen Beetle. On May 6, Roberta Kathleen Parks left her dormitory at Oregon State University to have coffee with friends at the Memorial Union, but never arrived. Investigators from Seattle and King County grew increasingly concerned. There was no significant physical evidence, and the missing women had little in common apart from a similar appearance, young, attractive, white college students with long hair parted in the middle. On June 1st, Brenda Carroll Ball, 22, disappeared after leaving the Flame Tavern in Burien, near Seattle, Tacoma International Airport. She was last seen in the parking lot talking to a brown-haired man with his arm in a sling. In the early hours of June the 11th, University of Washington student George Ann Hawkins vanished while walking down a brightly lit alley between her boyfriend's dorm and her sorority house. The next morning, 3 Seattle homicide detectives and a criminalist combed the entire alleyway on their hands and knees, finding nothing. Bundy later told Keppel that he lured Hawkins to his car and knocked her unconscious with a crowbar. After handcuffing her, he drove her to a suburb 20 miles east of Seattle, where he strangled her and spent the entire night with her body. He later returned to the University Alley the morning after, and in the very midst of a major crime scene investigation, located and gathered Hawkins' earrings and one of her shoes, where he had left them in the adjoining car park, and departed unobserved. Quote, "It was a feat so brazen that it astonishes police even today," end quote, wrote Keppel. Bundy said he revisited Hawkins' corpse on 3 occasions. After her disappearance was publicised, witnesses came forward to report seeing a man in an alley behind a nearby dormitory on the night of her disappearance. He was on crutches with a leg cast and was struggling to carry a briefcase. One woman recalled that the man asked her to help him carry the case to his car, a light brown Volkswagen Beetle. During this period, Bundy was working in Olympia as the assistant director of the Seattle Crime Prevention Advisory Commission, where he wrote a pamphlet for women on rape prevention. Later, he worked at the Department of Emergency Services, a state government agency involved in the search for the missing women. At the department, he met and began dating Carol Ann Boone, a twice-divorced mother of two, who would play an important role in the final phase of his life 6 years later. Bundy's 1968 Volkswagen Beetle, in which he committed many of his crimes. The vehicle was on display at the now defunct National Museum of Crime and Punishment and is now at the Alcatraz East Crime Museum in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee. Reports of the brutal attack on Karen Sparks and the 6 missing women appeared prominently in newspapers and on TV throughout Washington and Oregon. Fear spread among the population, hitchhiking by young women dropping sharply. Pressure mounted on law enforcement agencies, but physical evidence and the lack thereof severely hampered them. Police would not provide reporters with the little information that was available for fear of compromising the investigation. Further similarities between the victims were noted. The disappearances all took place at night, usually near outgoing construction work, and were within a week of midterm or final exams. All of the victims were wearing slacks or blue jeans when they disappeared, and at many crime scenes there were sightings of a man wearing a cast or a sling and driving a brown or tan Volkswagen Beetle. The Oregon and Washington murders culminated on July 14th with the broad daylight abduction of 2 women from a crowded beach at Lake Sammamish State Park. 5 female witnesses described an attractive young man wearing a white tennis outfit with his left arm in a sling, speaking with a light accent, perhaps Canadian or British, introducing himself as Ted. He asked for their help in unloading a sailboat from his tan bronze-coloured Beetle. 4 refused. 1 accompanied him as far as his car, saw that there was no sailboat and fled. 3 additional witnesses saw him approach Janice Ann Ott, 23, a probation officer at the King County Juvenile Court, with the sailboat story, and watched her leave the beach in his company. About 4 hours later, Denise Marie Naisland, a 19-year-old woman who was studying to become a computer programmer, left a picnic to go to the restroom and never returned. Bundy told Stephen and William that Ott was still alive when he returned with Naisland, and that he forced one to watch as he murdered the other, but he later denied it in an interview with Lewis on the eve of his execution. King County Police, finally armed with a detailed description of their suspect and his car, posted flyers throughout the Seattle area. A composite sketch was printed in regional newspapers and broadcast on local television stations. Elizabeth, the girlfriend, Anne Rule, the one that worked with him at the hotline and later became his biographer, a Department of emergency services employee and a University of Washington psychology professor all recognised the profile, the sketch and the car and reported Bundy as a possible suspect. But, here we go, with the but, detectives were receiving up to 200 tips per day, thought it was unlikely that a clean-cut law student with no adult criminal record could be the perpetrator. On September 6, 2 grouse hunters stumbled across the skeletal remains of Ott and Naseland near a service road. An extra femur and several vertebrae found at the site were later identified by Bundy as those of Hawkins. 6 months later, forestry students from Green River Community College discovered the skulls and mandibles of Healy, Rancourt, Parks and Ball on Taylor Mountain, where Bundy frequently hiked. Manson's remains were never recovered. In August 1974, Bundy received a second acceptance from University of Utah Law School and moved to Salt Lake City, leaving Elizabeth in Seattle. While he called her often, he dated, quote, at least a dozen, end quote, other women, as he studied the first year law curriculum a second time. He was devastated to find out that the other students, quote, had something, some intellectual capacity, end quote, that he did not. He found the classes completely incomprehensible. Quote, it was a great disappointment to me, end quote, he said. A new string of homicides began the following month, including 2 that would remain undiscovered until Bundy confessed to them shortly before his execution. On September the 2nd, he raped and strangled a still unidentified hitchhiker in Idaho, then either disposed of the remains immediately in a nearby river or returned the next day to photograph and dismember the corpse. On October the 2nd, he abducted 16-year-old Nancy Wilcox in Holiday in Utah, a suburb of Salt Lake City. Bundy informed investigators that her remains were buried near Capitol Reef National Park, but they were never found. On October the 18th, Melissa Ann Smith, a 17-year-old daughter of a police chief in Midvale, another suburb of Salt Lake City, disappeared after leaving a pizza parlour. Her nude body was found in a nearby mountainous area 9 days later. A post-mortem indicated that she may have remained alive for up to 7 days following her disappearance. On October 31st, Laura Ann Aim, also 17, disappeared after leaving a cafe just after midnight. Her naked body was found by hikers 9 miles to the northeast in American Fork Canyon on Thanksgiving Day. Both girls had been beaten, raped, sodomized and strangled with nylon stockings. Years later, Bundy described his post-mortem rituals with the corpses of Smith and Aim, including hair shampooing and the application of makeup. In the late afternoon of November 8th, Bundy approached 18-year-old telephone operator Carol Durant at Fashion Place Mall in Murray, less than a mile from the Midvale restaurant where Smith was last seen. He identified himself as Officer Roseland of the Murray Police Department and told Durant that someone had attempted to break into her car. He asked her to accompany him to the station to file a complaint. When Durant pointed out to Bundy that he was driving on a road that did not lead to the police station, he immediately pulled into the shoulder and attempted to handcuff her. During their struggle, he inadvertently fastened both handcuffs to the same wrist, and Durant was able to open the car door and escape. Later that evening, Deborah Jean Kent, a 17-year-old student at Viewmont High School in Bountiful, disappeared after leaving a theatre production at the school to pick up her brother. The school's drama teacher and a student told police that, quote, a stranger had asked each of them to come out to the parking lot to identify a car. Another student later saw the same man pacing in the rear of the auditorium, and the drama teacher spotted him again shortly before the end of the play. Outside the auditorium, investigators found a key that unlocked the handcuffs removed from Durant's wrist. In November, Elizabeth, the ex-girlfriend with the 3-year-old, called King County Police a second time after reading that young women were disappearing in towns surrounding Salt Lake City. Detective Randy of the Major Crime Division interviewed her in detail. By then, Bundy had risen considerably on the King County hierarchy of suspicion, but the Lake Sammamish witness, considered most reliable by detectives, failed to identify him from a photo lineup. In December, Elizabeth called the Salt Lake County Sheriff's Office and repeated her suspicions. Bundy's name was added to their list of suspects, but at that time, no credible forensic evidence linked him to the Utah crimes. In January 1975, Bundy returned to Seattle after his final exams and spent a week with Elizabeth, who did not tell him that she had reported him to the police on 3 occasions. She made plans to visit him in Salt Lake City in August. In 1975, Bundy shifted much of his criminal activity eastward from his base in Utah to Colorado. On January the 12th, a 23-year-old registered nurse named Karen Eileen Campbell disappeared while walking down a well-lit hallway between the elevator and her room at the Wildwood Inn in Snowmass Village. Her nude body was found a month later next to a dirt road just outside the resort. She had been killed by blows to her head from a blunt instrument that left distinctive linear grooved depressions on her skull. Her body also bore deep cuts from a sharp weapon. On March the 15th, a ski instructor, Julie Cunningham, 26, disappeared while walking from her apartment to a dinner date with a friend. Bundy later told Colorado investigators that he approached Cunningham on crutches and asked her to help carry his ski boots to his car, where he clubbed and handcuffed her before sexually assaulting and strangling her at a secondary site near Rifle. Weeks later, he made the 6-hour drive from Salt Lake City to revisit her remains. Denise Lynn Oliverson, 25, disappeared near the Utah-Colorado border in Grand Junction on April 6 while riding her bicycle to her parents' house. Her bike and sandals were found under a viaduct near a railroad bridge. On the 6th of May, Bundy lured 12-year-old Lynette Dawn Culver from Alameda Junior High School in Idaho. He drowned her in his hotel room after he disposed of her body in a river. In mid-May, 3 of Bundy's Washington State Department Emergency Services co-workers, including Boone, visited him in Salt Lake City and stayed for a week in his apartment. He subsequently spent a week in Seattle with Elizabeth in early June, and they discussed getting married the following Christmas. Again, Elizabeth made no mention of her multiple discussions with authorities in King County and Salt Lake County. I wouldn't have done either. To be fair, I would not have mentioned that. Bundy disclosed neither his ongoing relationship with Boone or a concurrent romance with a Utah law student known in various accounts as Kim Andrews. On June the 28th, Susan Curtis vanished from the campus of Brigham Young University. Her murder became Bundy's last confession, tape-recorded moments before he entered the execution chamber. The bodies of Wilcox, Kent, Cunningham, Oliverson, Culver and Curtis were never recovered. In August or September of 1975, Bundy was baptized into the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Although he was not an active participant in services and ignored most church restrictions, he would later be withdrawn from the church following his 1976 kidnapping conviction. When asked his religious preference after his arrest, Bundy answered Methodist, the religion of his childhood. In Washington state, investigators were still struggling to analyze the Pacific Northwest murder spree that had ended abruptly as it begun. In an effort to make sense of an overwhelming mass of data, they resorted to the then innovative strategy of compiling a database. They used the King County payroll computer, a huge primitive machine by contemporary standards, but the only one available for their use. After inputting the many lists they had compiled, classmates and acquaintances of each victim, Volkswagen owners named Ted, known sex offenders, and so on, they queried the computer for coincidences. Out of thousands of names, 26 turned up on 4 lists. One was Ted Bundy. Detectives also manually compiled a list of their 100 best suspects, and Bundy was on that list as well. He was literally at the top of the pile of suspects when word came from Utah for his arrest. Now, I'm assuming all of you true crime fanatics all know what a murder kit is. It's generally a bag that includes garbage bags, masks, stockings, a flashlight, crowbar, ice picks, gloves. That's just what was found in Bundy's. But yeah, they were found in his Volkswagen in Utah in 1975. On August the 16th, 1975, Bundy was arrested by Utah Highway Patrol Officer Bob Hayward in Granger, another Salt Lake City suburb. Hayward observed Bundy cruising a residential area in his Beetle during the pre-dawn hours and fleeing at high speed after seeing the patrol car. He noticed that the Volkswagen's front passenger seat had been removed and placed on the rear seats, and he searched the car, and he found the murder bag, is what we're going to call it. The police officer assumed it to be burglary tools. Bundy explained that the ski mask was for skiing. He had found the handcuffs in a dumpster, and the rest were just common household items. However, Detective Jerry Thompson remembered a similar suspect and car description from the November 1974 DeRonch kidnapping, and Bundy's name from Elizabeth's phone call a month earlier. In a search of Bundy's apartment, police found a guide to Colorado, ski resorts with a check mark by the Wildwood Inn, and a brochure that advertised the Viewmont High School play in Bountiful, where Kent had disappeared. The police did not have sufficient evidence to detain Bundy, so he was released on his own recognizance. Yeah, that word. Bundy later said that searchers missed a hidden collection of Polaroid photographs of his victims, which he destroyed after he was released. Salt Lake City police placed Bundy on 24-hour surveillance, and Thompson flew to Seattle with 2 other detectives to interview Elizabeth. She told them that in the year prior to Bundy's move to Utah, she had discovered objects that, quote, she couldn't understand, end quote, in her house and in Bundy's apartment. These items included crutches, a bag of plaster of Paris, and he admitted stealing from a medical supply house a meat cleaver that was never used for cooking. Additional objects included surgical gloves, an oriental knife in a wooden case that he kept in his glove compartment, and a stack of women's clothing. Bundy was in debt, and Elizabeth suspected that he had stolen almost everything of significant value that he possessed. When she confronted him over a new TV and stereo, he warned her, quote, "If you tell anyone, I'll break your darkin neck," end quote. She said Bundy became very upset whenever she considered cutting her hair, which was long and parted in the middle. She would sometimes awaken in the middle of the night to find him under the bed covers with a flashlight, examining her body. He kept a log wrench taped halfway up the handle in the trunk of her car, another beetle, which he often borrowed for protection. The detectives confirmed that Bundy had not been with Elizabeth on any of the nights during the Pacific Northwest victims when they vanished, nor the day that Ott and Naseland were abducted from Lake Sammamish State Park. Shortly thereafter, Elizabeth was interviewed by Seattle homicide detective Cassie McChesney and learned of the existence of Diane Edwards and her brief engagement to Bundy at around Christmas 1973. In September, Bundy sold his beetle to a Midvale teenager. Utah police impounded it, and FBI technicians dismantled and searched it. They found hairs matching samples obtained from Campbell's body. Later, they also identified hair strands from those of Smith and DeRonch. FBI lab specialist Robert Neal concluded that the presence of hair strands in one car matching 3 different victims who had never met one another would be, quote, a coincidence of mind-boggling rarity, end quote. On October the 2nd, detectives put Bundy into a lineup. DeRonch immediately identified him as Officer Roseland, and witnesses from Bountiful recognised him as the stranger with the Viewmont High School auditorium. There was insufficient evidence to link him to Kent, whose body was never found, but more than enough evidence to charge him with aggravated kidnapping and attempted criminal assault in the DeRonch case. He was freed on $15,000 bail paid by his parents and spent most of the time between indictment and trial in Seattle, living in Elizabeth's house. Seattle police had insufficient evidence to charge him in the Pacific Northwest murders, but kept him under close surveillance. Quote, when Ted and I stepped out on the porch to go somewhere, so many unmarked police cars started up that it sounded like the beginning of the Indy 500, end quote. A quote from Elizabeth. In November, the 3 principal Bundy investigators, Jerry Thompson from Utah, Robert Keppel from Washington, and Michael Fisher from Colorado, met in Aspen and exchanged information with 30 detectives and prosecutors from 5 states. While officials left the meeting convinced that Bundy was the murderer that they had been seeking, they agreed that more hard evidence would be needed before he could be charged with any of the murders. In February 1976, Bundy stood trial for the DeRonch kidnapping. On the advice of his attorney, John O'Connell, he waived his right to a jury due to the negative publicity surrounding the case. After a 4-day bench trial and a weekend of deliberation, Judge Stuart Hanson Jr. found him guilty of kidnapping and assault. In June, he was sentenced to 1 to 15 years in the Utah State Prison. In October, he was found hiding in bushes in the prison yard, carrying an, quote, escape kit, road maps, airline schedules, and a social security card, and spent several weeks in solitary confinement. Later that month, Colorado authorities charged him with Campbell's murder. After a period of resistance, he waived extradition proceedings and was transferred to Aspen in January 1977. On June the 7th in 1977, Bundy was transported 40 miles from Garfield County Jail in Glenwood Springs to Pitkin County Courthouse in Aspen for a preliminary hearing. He had elected to serve as his own attorney and as such excused by the judge from wearing handcuffs or leg shackles. Now, not only does this prove to be a mistake, but it also proves the narcissism. During a recess, he asked to visit the courthouse's law library to research his case. While shielded from his guard's view behind a bookcase, he opened a window and jumped to the ground from the second story, injuring his right ankle as he landed. After shedding an outer layer of clothing, Bundy walked through Aspen as roadblocks were being set up on its outskirts, then hiked southward towards Aspen Mountain. Near its summit, he broke into a hunting cabin and stole food, clothing, and a rifle. The following day, he left the cabin and continued south towards the town of Crested Butte, but became lost in the forest. For 2 days, he wandered aimlessly on the mountain, missing 2 trails that led downward to his intended destination. On June 10th, he broke into a camping trailer on Maroon Lake, 10 miles south of Aspen, taking food and a ski parka. But instead of continuing southward, he walked back north towards Aspen, eluding roadblocks and search parties along the way. There's no end to this talent, is there? 3 days later, he stole a car at the edge of Aspen Golf Course. Cold, sleep-deprived, and in constant pain from his sprained ankle, Bundy drove back to Aspen, where 2 police officers noticed his car weaving in and out of its lane and pulled him over. He had been a fugitive for 6 days. In the car were maps of the mountain area around Aspen that prosecutors were using to demonstrate the location of Campbell's body. As his own attorney, Bundy had rights of discovery, indicating that his escape was not a spontaneous act, but had been planned. Back in jail in Glenwood Springs, Bundy ignored the advice of friends and legal advisors to stay put. The case against him, already weak at best, was deteriorating steadily as pretrial motions consistently resolved in his favour and significant bits of evidence were ruled inadmissible. Quote, "A more rational defendant might have realised that he stood a good chance of acquittal, and that beating the murder charge in Colorado would probably have dissuaded other prosecutors. With as little as a year and a half to serve on the DeRonch conviction, had Ted persevered, he could have been a free man, end quote. Instead, Bundy assembled a new escape plan. He acquired a detailed floor plan of the Garfield County Jail and a hacksaw blade from other inmates, and accumulated $500 in cash, smuggled in over a 6-month period. He later said by visitors, Boone in particular, during the evenings while other prisoners were showering, he sawed a hole about 1 square foot between the steel reinforcing bars in his cell's ceiling, and, having lost 35 pounds, was able to wiggle through it into the crawl space above. In the weeks that followed, he made a series of practice runs exploring the space. Multiple reports from an informant of movement within the ceiling during the night were not investigated. Now, I remember, side note, being completely obsessed, and I'm going back a good number of years, with Prison Break, with Michael Scofield and his brother Lincoln. And my mum said to me that this is so far-fetched, like she wasn't into it. I'm going to say, well, hang on a minute. If Michael Scofield is so far-fetched, I think Ted Bundy is. I mean, it is that in a nutshell. Like, he has free reign of the prison, for goodness sake. Back to it. By late 1977, Bundy filed a motion for a change of venue to Denver. On December 23rd, the Aspen trial judge granted the request, but to Colorado Springs, where juries had historically been hostile to murder suspects. On the night of December 30th, with most of the jail staff on Christmas break and non-violent prisoners on furlough with their families, Bundy piled books and files in his bed, covered them with a blanket to stimulate his sleeping body, and climbed into the crawl space. He broke through the ceiling into the apartment of the chief jailer, who was out for the evening with his wife, changed into street clothes from the jailer's closet, and walked out the front door to freedom. Now, do you see what I mean? After stealing a car, Bundy drove eastward out of Glenwood Springs, but the car soon broke down in the mountains on Interstate 70. A passing motorist gave him a ride into Vail, 60 miles to the east. From there, he caught a bus to Denver, where he boarded a morning flight to Chicago. This guy must have been all over the news at this point. Yeah, here he is catching planes. And back in Glenwood Springs, the jail's skeleton crew didn't discover the escape until noon on December 31st, more than 17 hours later. By then, Bundy was in Chicago. From Chicago, Bundy travelled by train to Ann Arbor in Michigan, where he was present in a local tavern on January the 2nd. 5 days later, he stole a car and drove south to Atlanta, where he boarded a bus and arrived in Tallahassee, in Florida. On the morning of January the 8th, he stayed for one night at a hotel before he rented a room under the alias Chris Hagen at a boarding house near the Florida State University campus. Bundy later said that he had initially resolved to find legitimate employment and refrain from further criminal activity. Yeah, bet his nose grew there, knowing he could probably remain free and undetected in Florida indefinitely as long as he didn't attract the attention of police. But his lone job application at a construction site had to be abandoned when he was asked to produce identification. Yeah, there's always a flaw in that plan, isn't there? He reverted to his old habits of shoplifting and stealing money and credit cards from women's wallets left in shopping carts at local grocery stores. In the early hours of January the 15th in 1978, 1 week after his arrival in Tallahassee, Bundy entered Florida State University's Chi Omega sorority house through a rear door with a faculty locking mechanism. Beginning at around 2:45 a.m, he bludgeoned Margaret Bowman, 21, with a piece of oak firewood as she slept, then garroted her with a nylon stocking. He then entered the bedroom of 20-year-old Lisa Levi and beat her unconscious, strangled her, bit deeply into her left buttock and through the nipple on her right breast, and sexually assaulted her with a hair mist bottle. The attack with the hairspray bottle was so violent that it ruptured her internal organs. In an adjoining bedroom, he attacked Kathy Kleiner, breaking her jaw and deeply lacerating her shoulder, and Karen Chandler, who suffered a concussion, broken jaw, loss of teeth, and a crushed finger. Kathy and Karen survived the attack. Kathy attributed their survival to car headlights illuminating the interior of their room and frightening away the attacker. Bundy escaped, but not before being seen by sorority sister Nina Neary, who came through the back door and saw Bundy as he was exiting the sorority house. Tallahassee detectives determined that the 4 attacks took place in a total of less than 15 minutes, within earshot of more than 30 witnesses who heard nothing. After leaving the sorority house, Bundy broke into a basement apartment 8 blocks away and attacked student Cheryl Thomas, dislocating her shoulder and fracturing her jaw and skull in 5 places. She was left with permanent deafness and equilibrium damage that ended her dance career. On her bed, police found a semen stain and a pantyhose mask containing 2 hairs. On February the 8th, Bundy drove 150 miles east to Jacksonville in a stolen van. In a parking lot, he approached 14-year-old Leslie Parmenter, the daughter of the Jacksonville Police Department Chief of Detectives, identifying himself as Richard Burton Fire Department, but retreated when her older brother arrived and confronted him. That afternoon, he backtracked 60 miles westward to Lake City. At Lake City Junior High School the following morning, 12-year-old Kimberly Diane Leach was summoned to her homeroom by a teacher to retrieve a forgotten purse. She never returned to class. 7 weeks later, after an intensive search, her partially mummified remains were found in a pig farrowing shed near River State Park, 35 miles northwest of Lake City. She appeared to have been raped, then killed by neck lacerations with a knife. On February 12th, with insufficient cash to pay for his overdue rent and a growing suspicion that police were closing in on him, Bundy stole a car and fled Tallahassee, driving westward across the Florida Panhandle. 3 days later, at around 1 a.m., he was stopped by a police officer, David Lee, near the Alabama state line after a wants and warrants check showed his Volkswagen Beetle was stolen. When told he was under arrest, Bundy kicked Lee's legs out from under him and took off running. Lee fired 2 warning shots, then gave chase and tackled him. The two struggled over Lee's gun before the officer finally subdued and arrested Bundy. In the stolen vehicle, there were 3 sets of IDs belonging to female students, 21 stolen credit cards, and a stolen TV. Also found were a pair of dark-rimmed, non-prescription glasses and a pair of plaid slacks, later identified as the disguise worn by Richard Burton Fire Department in Jacksonville. As Lee transported his suspect to jail, unaware that he had just arrested one of the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives, he heard Bundy say, "I wish you had killed me." Following a change of venue to Miami, Bundy stood trial for the Chi Omega homicides and assaults in June 1979. The trial covered by 250 reporters from 5 continents and was the first to be televised nationally in the United States. Despite the presence of 5 court-appointed attorneys, Bundy again handled much of his own defence. From the beginning, he sabotaged the entire defence effort out of spite, distrust, and grandiose delusion, Nelson later wrote. Ted was facing murder charges with a possible death sentence, and all that mattered to him apparently was that he had to be in charge. According to Mike Minerva, a Tallahassee public defender and member of the defence team, a pre-trial plea bargain was negotiated in which Bundy would plead guilty to killing Lisa Levi, Bowman and Leach in exchange for a firm 75-year prison sentence. Prosecutors were amenable to a deal, by one account because, quote, prospects of losing at trial were very good, end quote. Bundy, on the other hand, saw the plea deal not only as a means of avoiding the death penalty, but also as a tactical move, he could enter in his plea, then wait a few years for evidence to disintegrate or become lost, and for witnesses to die, move on, or retract their testimony. Once the case against him had deteriorated beyond repair, he could file a post-conviction motion to set aside the plea and secure an acquittal. At the last minute, however, Bundy refused the deal. Quote, "It made him realise he was going to have to stand up in front of the whole world and say he was guilty. He just couldn't do it." End quote. At trial, crucial testimony came from Chi Omega, sorority members Connie Hastings, who placed Bundy in the vicinity of the sorority house that evening, and Nita Neary, who saw him leaving the house clutching the murder weapon. Incriminating physical evidence included impressions of the bite wounds Bundy had inflicted on Lisa's left buttock, which forensic dentist Richard and Lowell matched to castings of Bundy's teeth. The jury deliberated for less than 7 hours before convicting Bundy on July the 24th, 1979, of the Bowman and Levi murders. 3 counts of attempted first-degree murder for the assaults on Kleiner, Chandler and Thomas, and 2 counts of burglary. The trial judge, Edward Cowart, imposed death sentences for the murder convictions. 6 months later, a second trial took place in Orlando for the abduction and murder of Leach. Bundy was found guilty once again after less than 8 hours deliberation, due principally to the testimony of an eyewitness who saw him leading Leach from the schoolyard to his stolen van. Important material evidence included clothing fibres with an unusual manufacturing error found in the van and on Leach's body, which matched fibres from the jacket Bundy was wearing when he was arrested. During the penalty phase of the Leach trial, Bundy took advantage of an obscure Florida law providing that a marriage declaration in court, in the presence of a judge, constituted a legal marriage. As he was soon questioning Boone, who had moved to Florida to be near Bundy, had testified on his behalf during both trials, and was again testifying on his behalf as a character witness. He asked her to marry him. She accepted, and Bundy declared to the court that they were legally married. On the 10th of February in 1980, Bundy was sentenced for a third time to death by electrocution. As the sentence was announced, he reportedly stood and shouted, quote, "Tell the jury they were wrong," end quote. This third death sentence would be the one ultimately carried out nearly 9 years later. In October 1981, Boone gave birth to a daughter, Rose, and named Bundy as the father. While conjugal visits were not allowed at Florida State Prison in Rayford, where Bundy was incarcerated, inmates were known to pool their money in order to bribe the guards to allow them intimate time alone with their female visitors. Shortly after the conclusion of the Leach trial and the beginning of the long appeals process that followed, Bundy initiated a series of interviews with Stephen and Hugh, speaking mostly in third person to avoid, quote, the stigma of confession, end quote. He began for the first time to divulge details of his crimes and thought processes. Bundy recounted his career as a thief, confirming that Elizabeth's long-time suspicion that he had shoplifted virtually everything of substance that he owned. Quote, the big payoff for me was actually possessing whatever it was I had stolen. I really enjoyed having something that I had wanted and gone out and taken, end quote. Possession proved to be an important motive for rape and murder as well. Sexual assault, he said, fulfilled his need to totally possess his victims. At first, he killed his victims, quote, as a matter of expediency, to eliminate the possibility of being caught. But later, murder became part of the adventure. Quote, the ultimate possession was, in fact, the taking of the life, and then the physical possession of the remains, end quote. Bundy also confided in Special Agent William Hagmeyer of the FBI Behavioral Analyst Unit. Agent William was struck by the, quote, deep, almost mystical satisfaction that Bundy took in murder. He said that after a while, murder is not just a crime of lust or violence. It becomes possession. They are part of you. The victim becomes a part of you, and you two are forever one. And the grounds where you kill them or leave them become sacred to you, and you will always be drawn back to them, end quote. That's what Bundy told him. He also said that he considered himself to be an amateur and an impulsive killer in his early years before moving into what he termed his prime or predator phase at about the time of Healy's murder in 1974. This implied that he began killing well before 1974, although he never explicitly admitted having done so. In July 1984, prison guards found 2 hacksaw blades hidden in Bundy's cell. A steel bar in one of those cell windows had been sawed completely through at the top and bottom and glued back into place with a homemade soap-based adhesive. Several months later, guards found an unauthorized mirror and Bundy was moved to a different cell. Shortly thereafter, he was charged with a disciplinary infraction for unauthorized correspondence with another high-profile criminal, John Hinckley Jr. In October 1984, Bundy contacted Keppel and offered to share his proclaimed expertise in serial killer psychology in the ongoing hunt in Washington for the Green River Killer, later identified as Gary Ridgway. Keppel and Green River Task Force detective interviewed Bundy, Ridgway, remained at large for a further 17 years. Keppel published a detailed documentation of the Green River interviews and later collaborated with one of the authors that did Bundy's autobiography on another examination of the interview material. In early 1986, an execution date, March the 4th, was set on the Chi Omega convictions. The US Supreme Court issued a brief stay, but the execution was quickly rescheduled. In April, shortly after the new date, July 2nd, was announced, Bundy finally confessed to Hagmaier and Nelson what they believed was the full range of his depredations, including details of what he did to some of his victims after their deaths. He told them that he revisited crime scenes often, several times, to lie with his victims and perform sexual acts with their bodies until putrefaction forced him to stop. In some cases, he drove for several hours each way and remained the entire night. In Utah, he applied makeup to Smith's face and repeatedly washed Ames' hair. Quote, "If you've got the time, they can be anything you want them to be," end quote, he told Hagmaier. He decapitated approximately 12 of his victims with a hacksaw and kept at least one group of severed heads, probably the 4 later found on Taylor Mountain, Rancourt Parks, Bull and Healy, in his apartment for a period of time before disposing of them. Less than 15 hours before the scheduled July the 2nd execution, the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals stayed it indefinitely and remanded the Chi Omega case for review on multiple technicalities, including Bundy's mental competency to stand trial and erroneous instruction by the trial judge during the penalty phase, requiring the jury to break a 6-6 tie between life imprisonment and the death penalty, which ultimately were never resolved. A new date, November the 18th, was then set to carry out the Leach sentence. The 11th Circuit Court issued a stay on November the 17th. In mid-1988, the 11th Circuit ruled against Bundy, and in December, the Supreme Court denied a motion to review the ruling. Within hours of that final denial, a firm execution date of January 24th, 1989 was announced. Bundy's journey through the appeals court had been unusually rapid for a capital murder case. Quote, "Contrary to popular belief, the courts moved Bundy as fast as they could. Even the prosecutors acknowledged that Bundy's lawyers never employed delaying tactics, though people everywhere seethed at the apparent delay in executing the archdemon. Ted Bundy was actually on the fast track," end quote. With all appeal avenues exhausted and no further motivation to deny his crimes, Bundy agreed to speak frankly with investigators. He confessed to Keppel that he had committed all 8 of the Washington and Oregon homicides, for which he was the prime suspect. He described 3 additional previously unknown victims in Washington and 2 in Oregon with whom he declined to identify, if indeed he ever knew their identities. He said he left a 5th corpse, Manson's, on Taylor Mountain, but incinerated her head in Elizabeth's fireplace. Quote, he described the crime scene where the bones of Ott and Nusland and Hawkins were found, and it was almost like he was just there, like he was seeing everything. He was infatuated with the idea because he spent so much time there. He is just totally consumed with murder all the time. End quote. Nelson's impressions were similar. Quote, it was the absolute misogyny of his crimes that stunned me. His manifest rage against women. He had no compassion at all. He was totally engrossed in the details. His murders were his life's accomplishments. End quote. Bundy confessed to detectives from Idaho, Utah and Colorado that he had committed numerous additional homicides, including several that were unknown to the police. He explained that when he was in Utah, he could bring his victims back to his apartment, quote, where he would reenact scenarios depicted on the covers of detective magazines, end quote. A new ulterior strategy quickly became apparent. He withheld many details, hoping to parlay the incomplete information into yet another stay of execution. The new strategy, immediately dubbed, quote, Ted's Bones for Time scheme, served only to deepen the resolve of authorities to see Bundy executed on schedule, and yielded little new detailed information. In cases where he did not give details, nothing was found. Colorado detective Matt Lindvall interpreted this as a conflict between his desire to postpone his execution by divulging information and his need to remain in total possession. The only person who knew his victims' true resting places. When it became clear that no further stays would be forthcoming from the courts, Bundy supporters began lobbying for the only remaining option, executive clemency. Diana Weiner, a young Florida attorney and Bundy's last purported love interest, asked the families of several Colorado and Utah victims to petition Florida Governor Bob Martinez for a postponement to give Bundy time to reveal more information. All refused. Quote, the families already believed that the victims were dead and that Ted had killed them. They didn't need his confession. End quote. Martinez made it clear that he would not agree to further delays in any case. Quote, we're not going to have the system manipulated. For him to be negotiating for his life over the bodies of victims is despicable. End quote. Boone had championed Bundy's innocence throughout all of his trials and felt deeply betrayed by his admissions that he was in fact guilty. She moved back to Washington with her daughter and refused to accept his phone call on the morning of his execution. Quote, she was hurt by his relationship with Diana Wiener and devastated by his sudden wholesome confessions in his last days. End quote. Hagmaier was present during Bundy's final interviews with investigators. On the eve of his execution, he talked of suicide. Quote, he did not want to give the state the satisfaction of watching him die, end quote, Hagmaier said. Bundy was executed in the Rayford electric chair at 7:16 a.m. on Tuesday, January 24th in 1989. His last words were directed at attorney Jim Coleman, Methodist minister Fred Lawrence. Quote, Jim and Fred, I'd like you to give my love to my family and friends, end quote. Hundreds of revellers sang, danced, set off fireworks in a pasture across from the prison as the execution was carried out, then cheered as the white hearse containing Bundy's corpse departed the prison. He was cremated in Gainesville and his ashes scattered at an undisclosed location in the Cascade Range of Washington State in accordance to his will. Bundy was an unusually organised and calculating criminal who used his extensive knowledge of law enforcement methodologies to elude identification and capture for years. His crime scenes were distributed over a large geographic areas. His victim count had risen to at least 20 before it became clear that numerous investigators widely in jurisdictions were hunting the same man. Bundy's assault methods of choice were blunt trauma and strangulation, two relatively silent techniques that could be accomplished with common household items. He deliberately avoided firearms due to the noise they made and the ballistic evidence they left behind. He was a meticulous researcher who explored his surroundings in minute detail, looking for safe sites to seize and dispose of his victims. He was unusually skilled at minimizing physical evidence. His fingerprints were never found at a crime scene, nor any other incontrovertible evidence of his guilt, a fact he repeated often during the years in which he attempted to maintain his innocence. Other significant obstacles for law enforcement were Bundy's essentially anonymous physical features and a curious chameleon-like ability to change his appearance almost at will. Early on, police complained of the futility of showing his photograph to witnesses. He looked different in virtually every photo ever taken of him. In person, quote, his expression would so change his whole appearance that there were moments that you weren't even sure you were looking at the same person, end quote. Bundy was well aware of this unusual quality and he exploited it, using subtle modifications of facial hair or hairstyle to significantly alter his appearance as necessary. He concealed his one distinctive identifying mark, a dark mole on his neck with turtleneck shirts and sweaters. Even his Volkswagen Beetle proved difficult to pin down. Its colour was variously described as witnesses as metallic or non-metallic, tan or bronze, light brown or dark brown. Bundy's MO evolved in organisational and sophistication over time, as is typical of serial killers. Early on, it consisted of forcibly late-night entry followed by a violent attack with a blunt weapon on a sleeping victim. As his mythology evolved, he became progressively more organised in his choice of victims and crime scenes. Bundy was regarded as handsome and charismatic, traits he exploited to win the confidence of his victims and the people around him in his daily life. In situations where his looks and charm were not useful, he invoked authority by identifying himself as a police officer or a firefighter. Once Bundy had them near or inside his vehicle, he would overpower and bludgeon them. He would then transport them to a pre-selected secondary site, often a considerable distance away, and strangle them by ligature during the act of rape. Towards the end of his spree in Florida, perhaps under the stress of being a fugitive, he regressed to indiscriminate attacks on sleeping victims. At secondary sites, Bundy would remove and later burn the victim's clothing. He explained that the clothing removal was ritualistic, but also a practical manner, as it minimalised the chance of leaving trace evidence at a crime scene that could implicate him. Bundy took Polaroid photos of many of his victims. Quote, "When you work hard to do something right, you don't want to forget it." End quote. Consumption of large quantities of alcohol was an essential component. He needed to be extremely drunk while on the prowl in order to significantly diminish his inhibitions and to sedate the dominant personality that he feared might prevent his inner entity from acting out the impulses. In their last conversation before his execution, Bundy told Elizabeth that he had purposefully stayed away from her, quote, when he felt the power of his sickness building in him, end quote. Rule noted that most of the identified victims had long straight hair parted in the middle, like Diane Edwards, the woman who rejected him and who he then became engaged and rejected her. She speculated that Bundy's animosity towards his first girlfriend triggered his protracted rampage and caused him to target victims who resembled her. Bundy dismissed this. They just fit the general criteria of being young and attractive. After Bundy's execution, Rule was surprised and troubled to hear from numerous sensitive, intelligent, kind young women who wrote or called to say they were deeply depressed because Bundy was dead. Many had corresponded with him, each believing that she was his one and only. Several said they suffered nervous breakdowns when he died. Even in death, Ted damaged women. To get well, they must realise that they were conned by the master conman, that they are grieving for a shadow man that never existed. Bundy underwent multiple psychiatric examinations. The experts' conclusions varied. Dorothy Lewis, a professor of psychiatry at the New York University School of Medicine and an authority on violent behavior, initially made a diagnosis of bipolar disorder, but later changed her impression more than once. She also suggested the possibility of a multiple personality disorder based on behaviours described in the interviews and court testimony. A great aunt witnessed an episode during which Bundy, quote, seemed to turn into another unrecognisable person. Suddenly, inexplicably, found herself afraid of her favourite nephew as they waited together at a darkened train station. He had turned into a stranger, end quote. Lewis recounted a prison official in Tallahassee describing a similar transformation. He said, "He became weird on me. He did a metamorphosis, a body and facial change, and he felt that there was almost an odour emanating from him. Almost a complete change of personality. That was the day I was afraid of him," end quote. While experts found Bundy's precise diagnosis elusive, the majority of evidence pointed away from bipolar disorder and towards antisocial personality disorder. Bundy displayed many personality traits typically found in antisocial personality disorder. I'm just going to make this easier, okay, because that's a whole mouthful. But basically, antisocial personality disorder boils down to a sociopath or a psychopath. So we're going to call him a psychopath because without doubt that's what he is. Such as an outward charm and charisma with little true personality or genuine insight beneath the facade. The ability to distinguish right from wrong, but with minimal effect on behaviour, and an absence of guilt or remorse. Guilt doesn't solve anything, really, Bundy said in 1981. Quote, "It hurts you, I guess. I am in the inevitable position of not having to deal with guilt," end quote. There was also evidence of narcissism, poor judgment and manipulative behaviour. Sociopaths are egotistical manipulators who think they can con anybody. One psychiatrist even admitted sometimes he even manipulates me. Lewis, he once said, and I quote, "I always tell my graduate students that if they can find me a real, true psychopath, I'll buy them dinner. I never thought they existed, but I think Ted may have been one, a true psychopath without any remorse or empathy at all." Narcissistic personality disorder has been proposed as an alternative diagnosis in at least one subsequent analysis. On the afternoon before he was executed, Bundy granted an interview to James Dobson, a psychologist. He used the opportunity to make new claims about violence in the media and the pornographic roots of his crimes. Quote, "It happened in stages, gradually. My experience with pornography that deals on a violent level with sexuality is once you become addicted to it, I would keep looking for more potent, more explicit, more graphic kinds of material until you reach a point where pornography only goes so far, where you begin to wonder if maybe actually doing it would give that which is beyond just reading it or looking at it. End quote. Violence in the media, he said, quote, sexualized violence sent boys down the road to being Ted Bundys. The FBI, he suggested, should stake out adult movie houses and follow patrons as they leave. You are going to kill me, he said, and that will protect society from me. But out there are many, many more people who are addicted to pornography, and you are doing nothing about that. End quote. While Nelson was apparently convinced that Bundy's concern was genuine, most biographers, researchers and other observers have concluded that his sudden condemnation of pornography was one last manipulative attempt to shift blame by catering to Dobson's agenda as a long-time pornography critic. He told Dobson that true crime detective magazines had corrupted him and fueled his fantasies to the point of becoming a serial killer. Yet in a 1977 letter to Rule, he wrote, quote, "Who in the world reads these publications? I have never purchased such a magazine, and on 2 or 3 occasions have I ever picked one up." End quote. Rule and Ainsworth both noted that for Bundy, the fault always lay with someone or something else. But while he eventually confessed to 30 murders, he never accepted responsibility for any of them, even when offered that opportunity prior to the Chi Omega trial, which would have spared him the death penalty. He deflected blame onto a wide variety of scapegoats, including his abusive grandfather, the absence of a biological father, the concealment of his true parentage by his mother, alcohol, the media, the police, whom he accused of planting evidence, society in general, violence on television, and ultimately true crime books, etc., and pornography. He blamed television programming, which he watched mostly on sets that he had stolen, for, quote, brainwashing him into stealing credit cards. On at least one occasion, he even tried to blame his victims. Quote, "I have known people who radiate vulnerability. Their facial expressions say, 'I'm afraid of you.' These people invite abuse by expecting to be hurt. They subtly encourage it." End quote. He wrote that in a letter to Elizabeth. Bundy was always surprised when anyone noticed that one of his victims was missing, because he imagined America to be a place where everyone is invisible except to themselves, and he was always astounded when people testified that they had seen him in incriminating places, because Bundy did not believe people noticed each other. Quote, "I don't know why everyone is out to get me," he complained to Lewis. He really and truly didn't have a sense of the enormity of what he had done. a long-term serial killer erects powerful barriers to his guilt. Walls of denial that can be sometimes never be breached. Each time he was forced to make an actual confession, he had to leap a steep barrier he had built inside himself long ago. Upon assessment using the psychopathy checklist, Bundy was reportedly evaluated at 39 out of 40. A true and genuine psychopath. Now, the night before his execution, Bundy confessed to 30 murders, but the true total remains unknown. Published estimates have run as high as 100 or more, and Bundy occasionally made cryptic comments to encourage that speculation. He told Ainsworth in 1980 that for every murder publicised, there could be one that was not. When FBI agents proposed a total tally of 36, Bundy responded, quote, "Add one digit to that and you'll have it," end quote. Years later, he told Nelson that the common estimate of 35 was accurate, but Keppel wrote that Ted and I both knew the total was much higher. I don't think even he knew how many he killed or why he killed them. I have felt a bit guilty doing this episode because there are so many names, and I've gone with surnames to distinguish them. So I want to take a moment before we close this episode to just pay homage to all of the victims and their families, because there are so many names, sadly, that came into contact with Ted Bundy that I just want to pay homage to the victims. 1974, Washington, Oregon. January 4, Karen Sparks, aged 18, bludgeoned and sexually assaulted in her bed as she slept. Karen survived. February 1st, Linda Ann Healy, 21, bludgeoned while asleep and abducted. Remains were found. March 12th, Donna Gail Manson, 19, abducted while walking to a concert at Evergreen State College. Never found. April 17, Suzanne Elaine Rancourt, 18, disappeared after attending an evening advisors meeting at Central Washington State College. Remains found. May 6, Roberta Kathleen Parks, 22, vanished from Oregon State University. Remains found. June 1st, Brenda Carol Ball, 22, disappeared after leaving the Flame Tavern. Remains found. June 11th, George Ann Hawkins, 18, abducted from an alley behind her sorority house. Skeletal remains identified by Bundy as those of George Ann, along with 2 other remains. July 14, Janice Ann Ott, 23, abducted from Lake Sammamish State Park in broad daylight. Skeletal remains found. July 14, Denise Marie Naisland, 19, abducted 4 hours after Janice from the same park. Skeletal remains found. October 2nd, Nancy Wilcox, 16, disappeared in Holiday, Utah. Never been found. October 18th, Melissa Ann Smith, 17, vanished from Midvale. Body found 9 days later. October 31st, Laura Ann Aim, 17, disappeared from Utah. Body discovered. November 8th, Carol Durant, 18, attempted abduction in Murray, Utah, escaped from Bundy's car and survived. November 8th, Deborah Jean Kent, 17, vanished after leaving a school play in Bountiful. Minimal skeletal remains were found and positively ID'd. 1975, January 12th, Karen Eileen Campbell, 23, disappeared from a hotel hallway. Body discovered 36 days later. March 15th, Julie Cunningham, 26, disappeared on the way to a tavern in Colorado. Never found. April 6, Denise Lynn Oliverson, 25, abducted while cycling to her parents' house. Never found. May 6, Lynette Dawn Culver, 12, abducted from her high school in Idaho. Never found. June 28, Susan Curtis, 15, disappeared during a youth conference at Brigham Young University. Never found. 1978 in Florida. January 15th, Margaret Elizabeth Bowman, 21, bludgeoned and strangled as she slept at the Chi Omega Sorority House. January 15th, Lisa Levi, 20, bludgeoned, strangled, sexually assaulted as she slept. Karen Chandler, 21, bludgeoned as she slept. Survived. January 15th, Kathy Kleiner, 21, bludgeoned as she slept. Survived. January 15th, Cheryl Thomas, 21, bludgeoned as she slept 8 blocks from the Chi Omega. Survived. February 9th, Kimberly Diane Leach, 12, abducted from her high school in Lake City. Mummified remains were found. Other possible victims: Bundy remains a suspect in several unsolved homicides and is likely responsible for others that may never be identified. In 1987, he confided to Keppel that there were some murders that he would never talk about because they were committed too close to home, too close to family, or involved victims that were very young. Anne-Marie Burr, aged 8, vanished from her Tacoma home on August 31st in 1961 when Bundy was 14. An unknown tennis shoe imprint was found by the overturned bench used to enter her house. Due to the small size of the shoe, police believed the perpetrator was a teenager. The Burr house was on Bundy's newspaper delivery route. The victim's father was certain that he saw Bundy in a ditch at a construction site on the nearby campus the morning his daughter disappeared. Other circumstantial evidence implicates Bundy as well, but detectives familiar with the case have never agreed on the likelihood of his involvement. Bundy repeatedly denied culpability and wrote a letter of denial to the Burr family in 1986. But Keppel has observed that the Burr case fits all 3 categories of murders Bundy would never talk about, too close to home, and very young. Forensic testing of material evidence from the Burr crime scene in 2011 yielded insufficient intact DNA sequences for comparison with Bundy's, and as such, his involvement remains speculative. Flight attendants Lisa Wick and Lonnie Ree Tumble, both 20, were bludgeoned with a piece of lumber as they slept in their basement apartments, Seattle's Queen Anne neighbourhood, on June 23rd in 1966. Lonnie died. In retrospect, Keppel noted many similarities to the Chi Omega crime scene. Lisa suffered permanent memory loss as a result of the attack. Later contacted Anne Rule, quote, "I know that it was Ted Bundy who did this to us, but I can't tell you how I know," end quote. In the absence of incriminating evidence, Bundy's involvement remains unconfirmed. Vacationing college friends Susan Margaret Davis and Elizabeth Perry, both 19, were stabbed to death on May 30th, 1969. Their car was found that day abandoned beside the Garden State Parkway outside Somers Point, New Jersey, near Atlantic City, and their bodies, one nude, one fully clothed, were found in nearby woods 3 days later. Bundy attended Temple University from January through to May in 1969 and apparently did not move west until after Memorial Day weekend. While his accounts of his earliest crimes varied considerably between interviews, he told forensic psychologist Art Norman that his first murder victims were 2 women in the Philadelphia area. Biographer Richard Larson believed that Bundy committed the murders using his feigned injury ruse, based on an investigator's interview with Julia, Bundy's aunt. Ted, she said, was wearing a leg cast due to an automobile accident on the weekend of the homicides, and therefore could not have travelled from Philadelphia to Jersey Shore. There is no official record of any such accident. Bundy is considered a strong suspect in the case, and it remains open. Rita Patricia Curran, a 24-year-old elementary school teacher and part-time motel maid, was murdered in her basement apartment on July 19th in 1971 in Burlington, Vermont. She had been strangled, bludgeoned and raped. The location of the motel was where she worked. It happens to be adjacent to the Elizabeth Lund home for unwed mothers where Ted was born. And similarities to known Bundy crime scenes led retired FBI agent John Bassett to propose him as a suspect. Bundy told Keppel that he murdered a young woman in 1971 in Burlington when he was there to obtain information about his birth, but denied specific involvement in the current case. No evidence firmly places Bundy in Burlington on that date, but records note that a person named Bundy was bitten by a dog that week, and long stretches of Bundy's time, including the summer of 1971, remained unaccounted for. Curran's murder remains officially unsolved. Joyce LePage, 21, was last seen on July 22, 1971, on the campus of Washington State University, where she was an undergraduate. 9 months later, her skeletal remains were found wrapped in carpeting and military blankets, bound with rope in a deep ravine. Multiple suspects, including Bundy, have never been cleared, according to investigators. Whitman County authorities have said that Bundy remains a suspect. Kerry May Hardy, 22, disappeared on June 24th, 1972, from Capitol Hill, Washington, near Seattle. According to police, she was married at the time, and her disappearance was reported to the Seattle Police Department by her mother. Her remains were unearthed on September 6, 2010, by construction machinery in a grave measuring 2 feet or less in depth. The location where her body was found was in the general proximity where Ted Bundy discarded known victims near Interstate 90, only 5 miles from Bundy's mass grave at Taylor Mountain. Rita Lorraine Jolly, 17, disappeared from West Lynn, Oregon on June 29, 1973. Vicki Lynn Holler, 24, disappeared from Eugene, Oregon on the 20th of August 1973. Bundy confessed to 2 homicides in Oregon without identifying the victims. Oregon detectives suspected that they were Jolly and Holler, but were unable to obtain an interview with Bundy to confirm it. Both women remain classified as missing. Catherine Mary Devine, 14, was abducted on November 25, 1973, and her body was found the next month in the Capitol State Forest near Olympia, Washington. Brenda Joy Baker, 14, was seen hitchhiking on May 27th in 1974. Her body was found in a state park a month later. Though Bundy was widely believed responsible for both murders, he told Keppel that he had no knowledge of either case. DNA analysis led to the arrest and conviction of William E. Cosden for Devine's murder in 2002. The Baker homicide remains unsolved. Sandra Jean Weaver, 19, a Wisconsin native who had been living in Utah, was last seen in Salt Lake City on July 1st, 1974. Her nude body was discovered the following day near Grand Junction, Colorado. Sources conflict on whether Bundy mentioned Weaver's name during the death row interviews. Her murder remains unsolved. Melanie Suzanne, known as Susie Cooley, 18, disappeared on April 15th, 1975 after leaving high school in Colorado. Her bludgeoned and strangled corpse was discovered by road maintenance workers 2 weeks later. Gas station receipts placed Bundy nearby when she disappeared. She is included in some compilations of Bundy's victims, but Jefferson County authorities say the evidence is inconclusive and continue to treat her homicide as a cold case. Shelley Ray Robinson, 24, failed to show up for work on July 1st, 1975. Her nude, decomposed body was found in August. Again, gas station receipts placed Bundy in the area at the time, but there's no direct evidence of his involvement. The case remains open. Nancy Perry Bard, 23, disappeared from the gas station where she worked in Layton, Utah on the 4th of July 1975 and remains classified as a missing person. Bundy specifically denied involvement in this case during the death row interviews. Debbie Smith, 17, was last seen in Salt Lake City in early February 1976, shortly before the Durant trial began. Her body was found near Salt Lake City International Airport on April 1st, 1976. Though listed as a Bundy victim by some sources, her murder officially remains unsolved. Minutes before his execution, Hagmaier queried Bundy about unsolved homicides in New Jersey, Vermont, Illinois, Texas, and Miami. Bundy provided directions, later proven inaccurate, to Susan Curtis's burial site in Utah, but denied involvement in any of the open cases. In 2011, Bundy's complete DNA profile obtained from a vial of his blood found in an evidence vault was added to the FBI's DNA database for future reference in these and any other unsolved murder cases. And there we have it, guys. One very, very depraved individual with a shocking span of crimes, and I'm speechless, to be honest. I think the reason Ted Bundy is always up there in the true crime community is, one, his elusive behaviour. You know, he kind of admits things, takes things back, then denies all knowledge, even though a lot of those unsolved cases have the hallmarks of Ted Bundy all over it. I'm no detective. I don't know the evidence that's pointing towards any other people, but even reading it out to you guys, I'm thinking he was there. I just talked about him being there. So the fact that he was even anywhere near that area, you can pretty much guarantee that he had some involvement in it. But yeah, it's just very, very sad that so many young women came into contact with this individual. And we know, you know, he was very methodical. He and this is what I meant earlier, he is intelligent. He spent time methodically researching, not only staking out young women, but the secondary crime scenes, the time he spent at the secondary crime scenes. It was all very methodical, and if he'd only applied that brain to something else positive for the world or for his own life, he could have been one very rich, successful young man. I'm just appalled that he went down this road and he ends up in this playlist and not an inspiration playlist somewhere else. Thank you so very much for spending an evening with me. I didn't know. I knew it was going to be a long episode. Didn't bank on over 2.5 hours. But if you are still here, I truly appreciate you. Please know that. If you are on replay, thank you so very much. Please do leave your thoughts and comments. And for those of you who have joined me tonight, thank you for sharing your thoughts and your input and everything else. I've enjoyed spending time with you. I truly have. And roll on next Thursday. If you have any suggestions, please do contact me. Let me know, and I will get researching into them. I know Angela, sorry, I know you was looking forward to the one we discussed. He's coming up next week. I wanted to dive into this one, and I kid you not, it's taken me days upon days with researching and finding everything. Obviously, Ted Bundy was one very, very sick individual, and when we say that he spent time with the bodies, we don't just mean spending time with. He was very, very disgusting. I kept all of that out because I think I shared enough detail for you to get the picture. So yeah, thank you for spending time with me tonight. If you're on replay, I appreciate you too. And yeah, let's go find something happy to watch. Yeah, I truly appreciate you. Thank you so very much, and I shall see you next week for another true crime story time. And I will be live on Monday, as always, 8 p.m. my time in the UK, and we will draw some more winners. We have 3 winners coming up for Up to No Good, so please do join me for my live on Monday, and I will see you there. Stay safe out there. Bye.